Okay, so we're going to be talking about the immune response. So, inflammation versus the immune response. So, we know that inflammation is the same process, it's pretty generalized, it doesn't have a specific thing that happens. It just takes care of different types of trauma and inflammation the same way. Whereas the immune system is specific towards each antigen. So, an inflammatory response is the first line of defense, and inflammation happens first, and an immune response occurs after the initial inflammatory response. But inflammatory processes also happen within the immune system. Generally, it's necessary to have inflammatory processes for complete recovery. So does that make sense? Inflammation happens first, and immune system kicks in second, but during the immune response, there's also inflammatory processes happening too. For example, you come in contact with an antigen, inflammation can begin to happen, but also concurrently the immune system starts to respond. Okay, so a little bit more in detail. Inflammation response is an older mechanism. It's non-specific and it occurs the same way regardless of the type of injury. Versus immune response. Immune response is more advanced, has a capacity to remember the antigen, and responds more quickly on frequent subsequent exposures. So the immune system is a learned mechanism. It has the ability to remember the antigen and then make antibodies and keep them dormant until that antigen comes back again, and then it remembers how to kill the antigen. But sometimes the immune system can also work against us and get confused and attack your own body. Immune response and inflammation are both defenses against injury. It's how our body helps against injury. And they both may result in an increased level of disease or injury. So that's kind of like what I was talking about. Inflammation process is good, but sometimes inflammation can over-repair itself, which we know as overzealous repair. And then same thing with the immune system. Immune system can attack antigens for us and keep us healthy, but it can also go crazy and start attacking parts of our body that it thinks is an antigen but really isn't. Okay, so let's talk about antigens. Antigens are foreign objects that protect the body from itself. Antigens are foreign objects that the body protects from itself. And this can be anything. This can be food, dust, bacteria, viruses, particles, etc. Your body can differentiate between yourself and something that's not part of your body. For example, dust. My body can tell that the cells in my body are my cells, and then if dust is inhaled or something, that is not part of my body. Autoimmune disease. This happens when the body sees itself as an antigen. So autoimmune disease is your cells are attacking yourself, your own cells, because they think your own cells are antigens. Immunocompromised. How is this different than autoimmune? Well, immunocompromised is when the body no longer recognizes its non-self, so it doesn't defend. So for example, I inhale the dust, my body doesn't recognize the dust anymore. My body doesn't recognize the dust, so then it thinks, okay, good, we don't have to send out anything to get rid of the dust. So therefore, you become sicker easier and more prone to having viruses and diseases and stuff. Hypersensitivity. The body overreacts to an antigen. So this is just like an allergy. It's when you're hypersensitive to something. So let's just review. Autoimmune versus immunocompromised. Autoimmune disease, the body recognizes itself as its own antigen. Immunocompromised, body no longer recognizes any antigens and therefore does nothing. Okay, so what are the components of the immune system? We have the B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, natural killer cells, and macrophages. B lymphocytes make B memory cells and plasma cells. That's important to remember. Do macrophages make antibodies? No, macrophages do not make antibodies. That's important to remember as well. It's a test question. Lymphocytes, B cells. So, B cells develop from stem cell in bone marrow and reside in lymphoid tissue. Just think, B comes from bone. B cells come from bone marrow. When antigen, or anything that stimulates the immune system, stimulates a B cell, it goes to the site of an injury. We talked about the Wall-Dyer's ring in class, and that's basically the area in the back of the throat where there's lymphoid tissue in the tonsil area. Okay, lymphocytes, B cells. So there's two types of these B cells, and remember they come from bone marrow. You have a B memory cell, and then you have a plasma cell. So the B memory cell, I believe, remembers the antigen. And then the plasma cell releases the antibodies. And antibodies in the bloodstream are also known as immunoglobulins. So if you hear immunoglobulins, it's the same thing as an antibody. B cells are associated with humoral immunity. And all that term means is if you have humoral immunity, you are dealing with B cells. And then the immune complex is made up of an antigen plus a specific antibody. So, and that's what Miss Sparks had in class. The Y and the little red thing, that was the Y was the antibody, and the red thing was the antigen. They clicked together to make the immune complex. So, a little trick question, which antibody are we naturally born with as babies? And that is IgG. Plasma cells are the only ones responsible for making antibodies. So B memory cells don't make antibodies. Plasma cells do. Okay, lymphocytes, T cells. So we talked about the B cells, and now this is the T cells. They develop from stem cell in bone marrow and then travel to the thymus to mature. The T cells aid the B cells, enhancing antibody response. So anytime you have immunity and you're dealing with T cells, it's called cell-mediated immunity. So basically, humoral immunity is dealing with B cells, and then cell-mediated immunity is dealing with T cells. Okay, so basically T cells are just helping. They just come to help enhance the antibody response. Okay, natural killer cells. These are in circulation but not in tissue. So they're in the bloodstream but not in the tissues. They can destroy without recognizing specific antigens. And then natural killer cells typically respond to viruses and cancers. Okay, so then we need to talk about the types of immunity. There's 4 types. They can be passive or active. They can be naturally occurring or acquired. And what's the difference? So basically, there's 2 types that are passive and 2 types that are active. Passive immunity. Passive immunity assumes little or no work by the host body. It uses antibodies produced by another living individual to protect against infectious disease. Can be natural and can be acquired. So passive immunity, an example of this is the natural way. An example of natural passive immunity is breastfeeding. It's passed from mother through placenta to fetus, and it protects the infant's immature immune system. Remember, it's passing IgG. So, passive immunity, the natural way, is from mom to baby, and that's why it's passive, because the baby isn't learning how to have the IgG on its own. It's just simply getting it from another human community. So then, for example, if you have a person who is exposed to hepatitis B and they have not had a vaccine for it, and they now have to go and get those antibodies in a little shot. And basically that getting a shot of antibodies is a passive way of acquiring antibodies. So it's different than natural, because natural is coming from mom to baby. Acquired passive immunity is you're acquiring the antibodies through someone else still, because it's through a vaccine, but it's through just a shot, but it's not necessarily your own antibodies that you made. Okay? Now, that was passive. Remember, there's two types. Passive is natural, and then passive is acquired. Now we have two other types. Active immunity, active natural, and active acquired. So active means there is work by the host's body. So your body is creating your own immunity. So for example, active immunity natural. You're naturally exposed to microorganisms that cause disease. And then the body recovers through immune response. And then you develop your own antibodies. So, an example is chickenpox. You have your kid play with another kid that has chickenpox. You have naturally acquired this disease, and now your body is naturally developing its own antibodies for chickenpox. Okay? Okay. Acquired active immunity. This is where you ingest or inject altered microorganisms, or in other words, antigens. This doesn't produce disease, and it's a vaccination basically. So, active acquired immunity is a vaccination. A product of active acquired immunity is immunization. So, for example, you say you have not had chickenpox, and your body's never made antibodies for it. You need to get those antibodies. Well, the active way to do it is to receive a vaccine. And the vaccine is the disease. The vaccine doesn't have antibodies in it. The vaccine has the disease in it. So your body is still making its own antibodies, but the way you got the antigen to come into your body was different than naturally. You didn't just catch the disease from someone else. You got the disease from a vaccine. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Also, side note, viruses can be live or dead in vaccines. Yep, so that is the end of talking about immunity. So remember, there's 4 types. You have active, natural, and acquired, and then passive, natural, and acquired.